despite efforts by the former president's legal team to push the trial to a later date. In a ruling yesterday, the judge overseeing the case rejected Trump's request to delay the trial until the Supreme Court rules on his presidential immunity claims. But Trump's lawyers are trying another tactic, asking the judge to delay the trial because of prejudicial publicity. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office was quick to hit back. In a new filing, prosecutors say the former president has been the one to stoke and encourage publicity around the case, and that he shouldn't be rewarded with an adjournment based on media attention that he is actively seeking. Joining us now, NBC News legal analyst and former federal prosecutor Andrew Weissman. Andrew, does this case appear to be on track to start on the 15th?
Absolutely. All signs are that Judge Marana has had it. All of the scheduled motions were supposed to be in weeks, if not months ago. All of the efforts you're seeing at the last minute by the former president to delay this trial have been rejected. As you said, there is now this pending motion about delaying the case because of pretrial publicity. That is going nowhere fast. That as everyone, both sides agree that pretrial publicity is going to continue and not abate at any time. So that's not a reason to put the trial off. It's a reason to make sure you're careful with jury selection, to make sure you can find 12 jurors who are going to be fair and impartial and put aside whatever feelings they have about the case and decide just based on the facts. But we are now 11 days away. And, I knock on wood, I think there are no more delays that are going to happen. We're going to see jury selection begin a week from Monday.
So let's accept that possibly jury selection does begin on the 15th, a week from Monday. What are the opportunities for Team Trump to create delays within that process?
Well, jury selection itself is a critical phase, not just because both sides, need to make sure they're finding people who will be fair, but you also, as I said, really want to make sure that somebody doesn't sneak on the jury for one side or the other to decide the case not based on the facts and the law. The judge is going to be very, very careful. In a high-profile matter, that is always a problem. So that, I think, will take, certainly a few days of selection. It may take the whole week, but the judge is clearly going to move this case along. This is, once the trial starts, this is something that the judge has a very firm hand on. And I also think, you've seen this in the way he's been ruling. He is really, not putting up with these delay tactics. He's an experienced judge who is making very quick, very thorough decisions. So I just don't expect that we're going to see, once the trial starts, that kind of delay. Final thought is judges are very respectful of jurors' time. Remember, jurors are just everyday citizens. They really do not like to see either side delaying a case, which is considered very disrespectful of the time of the jurors.
Andrew, good morning. I want to bounce down to another case, a federal one in the state of Florida, where Jack Smith, the special counsel, and his team of prosecutors there have now questioned the jury instructions that Judge Aileen Cannon had planned to give to the jurors. Jack Smith calling the instructions flawed and wrong, saying they misconstrue the Espionage Act governing the way classified documents are handled. What do you read into this? What's the significance to the trial?
This is a big development. To understand what's going on, unfortunately, people need to understand there's a rule in the federal rules of criminal procedure that says that the trial judge, once a trial starts, has the power to enter a judgment of acquittal for the defendant, and that decision cannot be appealed if the judge does that without letting the case go to the jury. So that's sort of this sword of Damocles that a trial judge has under the federal rules. And what alarmed Jack Smith's team is that the judge was saying that she is buying Donald Trump's view that the Presidential Records Act applies to these criminal charges. And to do that, it means that she would be able to just, on that basis, dismiss the case once the jury is sworn. And that law is she is dead wrong. So her jury instructions gave two options to the parties, both of which were wrong, both based on the Presidential Records Act. And you don't have to be much of a lawyer to understand how wrong it is. The Presidential Records Act is a civil statute. It is not applicable to a criminal case. It is not what Donald Trump is charged with. So that is why you saw this very strong filing by Jack Smith that said, this is dead wrong. We need a ruling that this is what you're either intending to do or that you are rejecting it. But one way or the other, we need a ruling in advance of the trial, because if you stick to your guns and are doing what you're saying you're going to do, we are going to mandamus you, which means we're going to go to the 11th Circuit to get them to reverse this. Remember, the government has done this twice before. This would be the third time they would go to the 11th Circuit and seek a reversal of Judge Cannon's rulings.
And of course, Caddy K, the Presidential Records Act is the act that Donald Trump has hung his entire defense on. He's wrong about it. The Presidential Records Act does not cover what he did in taking all those documents to Mar-a-Lago and then obstructing the investigation. And that's why in this filing, Jack Smith said, quote, based on the current record, the PRA, the Presidential Records Act, should not play any role at trial at all. That's from Jack Smith.
I mean, it almost kind of ties into Donald Trump's view that he has immunity from everything because of the fact that he was president. Andrew, can I ask you one more question about the hush money case? It is the case that Democrats, when they realized this is the one that was going to go first, actually come to trial first, not just be put first or charged first. There was a sort of slight collective groan because many felt that it wasn't the strongest of the cases. It didn't pertain to January the 6th. It didn't pertain to the election itself. Now that it's here upon us and it is going to be the one that comes to trial first, are you hearing anything about it or anything? Can you kind of read the tea leaves of how it's going to play out that might make Democrats a little more confident about this being the trial that actually the American public, as they are weighing up their electoral decisions, gets to see and hear first and foremost?
Yes, absolutely. So one, I think it's really important for people to understand that while you might not think this case is as important, is as significant as the other three criminal cases, it is only because of the contrast. The two of the cases have to do with overthrowing our democracy. Another has to do with retaining the most sensitive classified documents deliberately and obstructing justice in connection with those. Those are incredibly serious. So I think this sort of pales only because of the comparison. Anyone else, any other politician who is indicted in New York for 34 felony counts, it would be pretty hard to say, gee, don't take that seriously. Don't look behind that curtain to see what's there. The other is, I think it's important for people to at least consider the way that Alvin Bragg, the DA, has talked about the case. It's very, very easy to give a short sort of moniker of hush money, because that is part of the case. But it's important to remember what the hush money was for. The hush money was being paid to keep evidence from the electorate in the 2016 election, right after the Access Hollywood very salacious, very publicized tape. This was an effort to not have more bad news by Donald Trump, where he, with a major media outlet, was keeping information from the public in the form of those payments. So one way to think about the case is just an election interference case, but not in 2020, but 2016. And that is the way it's going to be presented to the jury when this trial starts a week from Monday.
NBC News legal analyst and former federal prosecutor Andrew Weissman, thank you very much for your...
But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
That was Martin Luther King Jr. in Memphis, Tennessee, the night before he was assassinated. Today marks 56 years since his death. We're going to have Reverend Al join us this morning to talk about that extraordinary moment in our nation's history. Willie, it's just such an extraordinary speech on so many levels. It was April 3rd, 1968. It was raining outside. Martin Luther King was supposed to go deliver the sermon. He was too exhausted. I believe it was Ralph Abernathy who came back and said, Martin, you've got to go. Martin, you've got to go. And he went, and he delivered one of the most prophetic speeches in American history, foreseeing his own death the next day, understanding the challenges, and like Moses in the Old Testament, taken to the top of the mountain to see the promised land, but knowing that he would never get there himself, despite the long march of his people to that point. And to, that speech coming April 3rd, 1968, right before his passing, it was a march on Washington in 1963 that led to the passing of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in 64 and 65, which enshrined for the first time in our Constitution, in our nation's laws, the part of the promises made going back to 1776. And we have come a long way in many, many areas. A black president, a black vice president, black justices of the Supreme Court, black CEOs. And yet, Willie, sadly, there are many of us, and I'll include myself, who believed that the moral arc of the universe did bend upward and continued to bend upward. We've had a bit of a flattening out over the past 5, 6, 7, 8 years, an anger, a pushing back on some of the very recent gains made by Black Americans and people of color. And that's in large part what this election is about, whether we continue to move toward being that more perfect union than Martin Luther King Jr. envisioned that night in Memphis, or whether we go backwards to the 50s, to the 40s, to a time of two Americas, a divided America, a segregated America, an America at war with itself.
Yeah, a lot of that grievance for which Donald Trump has been a vessel for almost a decade now is exactly what you're saying, which is the progress that this country has made. A little too fast for some people in this country. They feel maybe they've been left behind, or perhaps now they're not the ones not getting the fair shake, and Donald Trump has tapped into that. But, man, you listen to that speech, Mike Barnacle, it's still, every time you hear it, sends chills up your spine. The delivery alone, the substance alone, but also now the context we know that would come the next day when Martin Luther King was shot and killed on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. He was there to walk alongside striking sanitation workers in Memphis, some of whom were living in squalor. He gave them hope, and he was killed that day on April 4th, 1968, in a day that, you were covering the news the day that shook the country and whose echoes are still felt today.
I was in Washington, D.C. the night that Martin Luther King was murdered. I was in Washington, D.C. The same night after he died, and Robert F. Kennedy was in Indianapolis giving another incredible speech in Indianapolis about the assassination. Soon, Washington, D.C. was in flames, along with a lot of other major cities in the country. The country seemed fractured. The republic seemed shaky. Were we going to hold? It did hold. It held then, it held throughout the year, and it held ever since. And I believe hope is still alive that it will continue to hold, despite the fractures in this nation that Joe just described.
Yeah, we believe that. This is a tweet from Martin Luther King III. Wrote it yesterday. Tomorrow is the anniversary of my dad's assassination. To the world, he was monumental, a titan of justice. But to me, he was a dad. He was at the center of our home and family. The world lost an incredible leader. We lost a loving father. Yolanda lost the chance to meet her grandfather. So we'll be talking more about Martin Luther King with Reverend Al and legacy today and the battle ahead.
It's also the anniversary of another consequential day in history. 75 years ago today, the North Atlantic Treaty, NATO, was signed in Washington. We'll discuss the significance of the alliance amid the war in Ukraine, which is nearing 800 days and counting. And the man who used to lead that alliance, former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, retired four-star Navy Admiral James Stavridis, is with us. He is Chief International Analyst for NBC News. Also with us, the host of Way Too Early, White House Bureau Chief at Politico, Jonathan Lemire, and U.S. Special Correspondent for BBC News, Katty Kay. And our top story this morning, amid growing tensions over the war in Gaza, President Biden and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu are expected to speak by phone today. This will be their first direct communication since the Israeli airstrike that killed 7 World Central Kitchen workers. Earlier this week, Biden expressed some of his strongest criticism of Israel to date, saying he was outraged and heartbroken by those deaths. Biden and Netanyahu last spoke on March 18th, when the president warned the prime minister against carrying out a military offensive in the southern city of Rafah. Meanwhile, World Central Kitchen founder Jose Andres is calling for an investigation into what he says was a deliberate attack on his organization's workers. Speaking on camera yesterday for the first time since the airstrike, Andres said the Israeli government's claim that the blast was accidental.
He was rejected.
He rejected that.
They were targeted systematically, car by car, because they were not successful in hitting. They keep trying. This happened over more than 1.5, 1.8 kilometers. So this was not just a bad luck situation where, oops, we dropped the bomb in the wrong place or no. Every country, obviously, that nationals, including the United States, that had nationals that died on this attack, we need to have an investigation that is neutral. Humanitarians and civilians should never be paying the consequences of war. This is a basic principle of humanity. At the time, this looks like it's not a war against terrorism anymore. Seems this is a war against humanity itself.
You know, so many investigations that need to be done, so many investigations that are being put off, so many investigations, you know, why are you tracking these trucks from an organization that you know is delivering tons of food of aid to Gaza to bring desperately needed aid to Gaza? Why were they tracking them? Why did they fire on them? They were clearly marked. After all, this is the same IDF. This is the same Netanyahu government that was bragging about their pinpoint precision and being able to kill Iranian leaders just a few days ago. And here, with pinpoint precision, with their logos on the top of these vans for the World Central Kitchen, missiles are delivered through the middle of those vans. and they're targeted. I mean, my God, and so many investigations coming after the war's over, we're told. Benjamin Netanyahu says
now is not
about
the time.
Those hostages. Now's not the time. The hostages who escaped, who took their shirts off, who raised their hands after escaping from the horror of being a Hamas hostage, and the IDF with their hands in the air, with their shirts off, IDF guns them down. Oh, that's an investigation we have to worry about later, too. And then Netanyahu knowing for a year beforehand of Hamas's plans, they had the plans in hand in the government, doing absolutely nothing about it, doing absolutely nothing about the illicit funding that Trump and Netanyahu knew about in 2018, the funding sources that kept Hamas's war machine alive. They looked the other way. They said, don't worry about it. And of course, as I've said on this show, and yet for some reason Netanyahu still is not having to answer for this. As I've said repeatedly, Netanyahu sent a representative up to Doha 3 weeks before the attack on October the 7th. The leaders of Qatar said, do you guys still want us to keep sending all this money to Hamas? The answer, yes, of course we do. Netanyahu was the chief sponsor of Hamas through Qatar. It was Netanyahu that was keeping the money flowing there. Well, but we can't investigate that until after the war's over. We can't do anything until after the war's over. We can't ask any questions about why Benjamin Netanyahu set up a situation where Hamas had the weapons, the powers, the means to basically walk into Israel, and assault the IDF and the famed Israeli Defense Forces with mopeds, drugged up terrorists, and paragliders? And Benjamin Netanyahu did nothing for hours while Israeli women were beaten and raped and killed, and grandmothers were beaten and burned to death. Babies were shot in their cribs. Parents had to watch these terrorists, I'd like to call them something else, these terrorists shoot their children in front of them. And children were forced to watch as these terrorists shot their parents in front of them. 1 hour goes by, Netanyahu's government does nothing. 2 hours, nothing. 3, 4, the rapes continue. 5 hours, 6 hours, nothing. 7 hours, not 8 hours, nothing. 10 hours. Some places 12, 13 hours, nothing is done. Well, what happened that day? How in the hell did Benjamin Netanyahu's government allow that to happen? Oh, you can't ask those questions. We're fighting a war. Why would you allow this man to continue running your country when he is responsible?
I think they're asking that question.
When he is responsible for Hamas being able to run loose in Israel and commit the worst atrocities against Jews since the Holocaust. We know the nature of Hamas. We know their stated goal has always been to kill Jews, to destroy Israel. Yet Netanyahu was funding them. Netanyahu had their war plans. Netanyahu did nothing. Netanyahu, he was asleep at the switch when this happened. I mean, Hamas, it's like scorpions. If you had a nanny put scorpions in your baby's crib, would you say, well, you know, it's a tough time right now. The baby's in the hospital. We better keep the same nanny until the baby... No! In this case, the man who is almost singularly responsible for letting Israel's guard down because he was too interested in fighting the rule of law in Israel. He was too interested in dividing one Israeli against the other. He was too busy tending to the needs of religious extremists, so much so that he kind of forgot to take care of the secular elements of the IDF and the Mossad and the intel services that had kept Israel safe since 1948. How long? How long? Let's bring in Admiral Stavridis. Admiral, I do not ask you to associate with a single word I said. I do though want to know how long. I believe, it is my belief, and if I am wrong, please push back. The damage, the harm that Benjamin Netanyahu is inflicting on Israel, that he has already inflicted on Israel, that he will inflict on Israel for years to come because of his behavior since and before October the 7th, seems to me is so massive that we're going to have to leave it to historians and future generations to sum it up. But I'm just wondering, how long does this continue? The hell that we're seeing play out in Israel and Gaza?
Let's start with the political. I think that the clock is indeed ticking on Benjamin Netanyahu for all the reasons you articulate. No democracy can tolerate that kind of incompetence on display again and again and again. That clock is ticking. And I think we're going to hear from the center of Israeli politics, the center left of Israeli politics, and they're going to demand answers appropriately to the questions you just posed. And I would indeed associate myself very strongly with all of that. I'll add that in the center of that cabinet is former general, leader of the Israeli Defense Forces, Benny Gantz, who is someone I worked with consistently during the 4 years I was Supreme Allied Commander in NATO. You're seeing a photograph of him right now. He's steady. He's deeply respected within that society, and he obviously knows the security and the international aspects of all of this. He gets it on how this is damaging Israel in the longer term. And Joe, you laid out very well all of the internal dynamics and questions. I'll give you a couple on the international scene, starting with a tormented, obviously heartbroken leader in Jose Andres, with whom I have worked on a number of different things in my capacity as chairman of the board of the Rockefeller Foundation. He's passionate, emotional, and appropriately furious at the idea that this attack on his forces could be called an accident. It was a deliberate shot. It was taken with bad intelligence, obviously. But I'll close with this. We absolutely...
And if the situation in Rafah gets worse, which it may do if the Israelis do eventually go into there, then we need to think how are we going to supply people with the food they need to survive. Because at the moment it looks worse, not better, today in Gaza.
Admiral, let's stipulate that war, something you know, is a tragic, lethal, messy business. Given that stipulation, why does it seem that the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, has such a high tolerance for civilian casualties, for collateral damage, much more so than any other army?
It's a complicated question, but I'll give you three thoughts on it. Number one, it is the raw emotion of failure on their own part. And what I mean by that is, as Joe said a moment ago, they saw these images of Israeli babies shot in their cribs that will engender immense emotion and fury in any military person, frankly, in any human being. So that's a predicate to what's happening in front of us. Number two is they live in the toughest neighborhood. They're up against foes who are like Hamas, rapists, mutilators, torturers. There is a component to their reaction that faces the fact of the the horrible aspects of those with whom they fight. You should never give in to that as a military professional. You should never give in to either of those emotions, but it is certainly part of the calculus. And then third and finally, and I don't mean this in any way to sound like an excuse for what's happening, but you just can't think of a worse military situation than 2.2 million innocent civilians, half of them children, caught in the crossfire. It's just an incredibly complex situation. So none of those are excuses. The IDF has got to up its game in taking care of that civilian population. And I'll conclude with this. Caddy mentioned Rafah a moment ago. There are 1 million Gazans in Rafah. The IDF cannot launch attacks into Rafah without securing the food, the medicine, the shelter for those 1 million people, and far preferably actually move them out of Rafah before they conduct military attacks. That's the point at which the IDF needs to overcome the emotions we talked about a moment ago, Mike. If they do not do that, I think these taps of weapons, notably offensive weapons, are going to start shutting down from the West.
You know, Willie, Donald Trump has risen in America by presenting false choices. We can't be a diverse nation and a strong nation. We can't move forward and progress without leaving too many people behind. If people of color are doing well, that must mean that white people are doing more poorly. If women have more rights than they've had before, then that must mean that men are suffering. It's always a false choice. He always plays one side against the other. That's what Benjamin Netanyahu has been doing for decades now in Israel. He presents a false choice to the world. And I think more importantly, geopolitically, he presents a false choice to America and America's leaders. And it is this. He says, you can have a secure Israel, but you cannot have at the same time a Palestinian people who have safety, dignity, and security. His twisted reality that has kept him in power for a long time in Israel and led us to where we are now is a twisted reality where he says you can only have a secure Israel if you have Palestinian people that are beaten down, downtrodden, subjugated, and suffering. Only if they're second-class citizens. So Benjamin Netanyahu, this has been his approach because his dream has been in Israel from the river to the sea. You know, Israelis rightly are offended when people talk about the need for a Palestine that's from the river to the sea because it's talking about wiping out Israel. Well, the shoe's on the other foot here. Because this is Benjamin Netanyahu's vision to push Palestinians out and have Israelis from the river to the sea. And he presents the United States a false choice. You either support my twisted vision of what I'm doing in Gaza and what I've been doing in the West Bank now for over a decade, robbing Palestinians of their homes, allowing religious extremists to set up illegal settlements, running roughshod over all Palestinian rights in the West Bank because it helps Benjamin Netanyahu politically with those religious extremists. You either do that or you're not a true defender of Israel. It is time, moms, dads, please put earmuffs on your children right now.
Okay.
It is time for Joe Biden. It is time for the United States Congress. It is time for Americans to call bullshit on that because that has led us to where we are today. And enough is enough. We can have two things at once. You know, if Netanyahu wants to do this, he has his choice. If he wants to continue taking Israel off a cliff, he has a choice. He can do that. But we Americans, we have a choice too. And our choice is not defined by what Benjamin Netanyahu says our choice is. Our choice is to say, we will continue to support Israel, but we're not going to continue to support the systematic killing of civilians. And if you want our support, this, and this. And anybody that says, after what we've seen, Willie, over the past couple months, anybody who says that that's anti-Israeli, they can go straight to hell, because they're dead wrong. There are those of us who have loved Israel, who've defended Israel, who have fought about Israel, who still love Israel, who actually went to battle with their fathers-in-law on national television over Israel, and would do it again. And
how it works is you got a 98% offset, okay? There's big gaps here is when you're selling a whole bunch of electricity back to the utility company.